Welcome, everyone. It's so wonderful to see so many folks here in the audience. I'm going to go ahead and jump in. Welcome to this virtual briefing event, Reality Check, Chinese Military Spending in Context, and Alternatives to a Bloated U.S. Defense Budget. I am so happy to be co-hosting this from my hat on with the Quincy Institute and co-hosted with Brown University's Cost of War Project. My name is Elizabeth Beavers. I'm going to moderate this conversation. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the Vice President of Public Affairs with the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, which is an action-oriented think tank that seeks to make war the exception and peace the norm. We produce scholarship and support advocates, grassroots, policymakers, and others in an effort to take the United States off a pathway of endless warfare toward rigorous diplomacy and peace. And it's such an honor to co-host this with Brown University's Cost of War Project. The project is part of Brown University's Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs. The Cost of War conducts and publishes research to facilitate debate about the ongoing consequences of the United States post 9/11 wars in Afghanistan, Iraq, and elsewhere, the costs of the U.S. global military footprint, and the domestic effects of U.S. military spending. The project builds on the work of over 60 scholars, experts, human rights advocates, and physicians from around the world, and aims to raise awareness and foster discussion by providing the fullest possible account of the human, economic, political, and environmental costs of U.S. militarism, laying the foundation for better informed U.S. foreign and domestic policies. And don't we need that more than ever in this moment? So absolutely honored to have the Cost of War Project hosting us, and many thanks to the Quincy Institute, my own organization as well. So today's webinar, the reason we're doing this, we're featuring and discussing a new paper that was published by Cost of War, written by Bill Hartung of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, titled Reality Check, Chinese Military Spending in Context. It's a great time for this conversation as Congress is considering its overall spending and budget that would fund the Pentagon at record levels, with a top goal of prioritizing the fight against China as a reason to raise those military spending levels, driven in large part by the perceived military threat that is posed by China. While some have claimed that China's defense spending is roughly on par with the U.S. spending, Bill's report reveals that the U.S. continues to outspend China on defense by a substantial margin. So we're going to talk about his paper. We're going to be joined by a couple of wonderful discussants. Luo Shuxian is the assistant professor in the Department of Asian Studies at the University of Hawaii, Mānoa. And Rorry Daniels is the managing director of the Asia Security Policy Institute, and we'll discuss the report's findings. We'll dig into it. We'll see if there's areas of disagreement. What can we flesh out? What does this mean for Congress and lawmakers in this moment? I want to let the audience know at any point, including right now, please go to the Q&A function below. That is where you can ask questions of our speakers, and there will be plenty of time towards the end to get to those, but ask them along the way. All right, so let's go ahead and jump in. As I mentioned, we are so lucky to be joined by Bill Hartung. He's the Senior Research Fellow for the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, and he is a contributor to the Cost of War Project as well. And so, Bill, I am going to just tee you up to ask you this question. So in 2022, the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, SIPRI as many call it, sort of infamously, they put out every year assessments of global military spending. And in 2022, they estimated that the full range of military spending by the U.S. was around $877 billion, but China's was around $292 billion. But around here in DC, many analysts and lawmakers have contested these numbers and said, actually, China's military spending is much higher than these numbers suggest, possibly even on par with the United States. So I want to kick things off by asking how you react to those assessments.
Badly. But I want to thank Elizabeth and the organizers and my co-panelists and all of you for joining us. The critique of the SIPRI numbers has two elements. One is, China doesn't count all of its military activities in its official budget. So things like some R&D and their paramilitary forces and so forth. But the SIPRI estimate accounts for all of that and more. So that's not really a reason to cast it into doubt. However, there's a more wonky issue, which is comparative purchasing power. Does China get more for a certain level of currency in terms of cheaper labor, cheaper inputs? And that's a legitimate issue, but it's not that easy to determine. So even the kind of most extravagant estimate of Chinese military spending, accounting for that purchasing power difference, still puts it about 59% of U.S. spending, so a little more than half. And the methodology is not entirely clear. The author himself says, take this with a little bit of a grain of salt, because these are sort of based on aggregate numbers, not, a detailed understanding of each element of what China spends on. And then the other thing to think about is some of the things that SIPRI counts, like, payments to retirees and their Coast Guard, are things that aren't in the official U.S. Pentagon budget. And if you added those and things like veterans benefit, the U.S. would be spending $1.3 trillion. So I would say in general to take these higher estimates with a considerable grain of salt. And also, we could get into this later, but spending alone isn't maybe the best measure of military capability. What kind of weapons are being built? Do they work? What kind of training? What kind of combat experience? What kind of strategy? What are the intentions of the rival powers? So I think it's important not to let those big numbers just sit out there. And people saying, well, we have to stay ahead of or match China and therefore increase our budget, because there's no reason to do that based on spending alone. But we'll get into some of the other issues later.
That's great. Thanks so much, Bill. And just one quick follow-up on that. Given your assessment that some of these claims about China's military spending are exaggerated, how do you see, what is the purpose of making that claim? What's the purpose of exaggerating it? How do you see it get utilized in the service of particular policy proposals, especially on the Hill?
Well, in the context of a lot of other claims that exaggerate China's military challenge to the U.S., it's basically like a headline. Oh my goodness, China's spending more than we think. We have to catch up. But it's hard to try to catch up when you're already outspending 2 to 1. I mean, if we were going to catch up, we'd probably go backwards. So, I think it's been used kind of disproportionately as part of the argument for spending more, and it doesn't really hold up.
Thanks for that. I want to go to you next, Shuxian. How do you react to Bill's assessment about China's military spending capabilities, and what do you see as the appropriate strategy for the U.S. to pursue with regard to China?
Sure. I think thank you for having me. I think I concur with the major points raised in Bill's report, in particular that that to put the need to put China's defense spending put in perspective. And on top of what Bill just discussed, I think it should be noted that since 2000, China's defense expenditure measured as a share of its own GDP has been around like 2%, as announced by the Chinese government. So the 2% is the minimum threshold that the United States have been pushing its NATO allies and Asian allies like Japan to ever, to ever reach. Because Japan's defense expenditure has been around like 1% until like late 2022 that the Kishida government cabinet released document aiming for raising Japan's defense spending to 2% of GDP by 2027. And also, I think China's defense spending is closely related to its economic performance, because when we talk about the growth rate of China, growth rate of China's defense spending, the two-digit growth rate of its spending ended in around 2015, 2016, as the Chinese economy began to slow down. And the Chinese spending may further slow down as a result of China's, the current economic trouble and its rapidly aging population. Let's remember, the Chinese government has more domestic socioeconomic issues to deal with that put more pressure on the government to spend more to provide, social safety net for, its aging population. And also, I think Bill's report underscored the importance of, redesigning the U.S. and allied forces in Asia around the concept of active denial. I think, if I recall correctly, there's mentioning on that concept, and Quincy has released, a very detailed report on that strategy, which emphasizes the increased resilience and also the defense nature of those forces and a more restrained approach to escalation, with the ultimate goal of fending off aggression rather than, subjugating the adversary. But there's one thing I have a slightly different opinion on division of labor proposal that envisions, a greater role, especially for Japan, in balancing against China's power and providing for its own defense. Because although the active denial strategy emphasizes, avoiding highly escalatory doctrines such as, deterrence by conventional or nuclear punishment, I think other factors such as, popular perceptions and grassroots sentiments should be taken into consideration when redesigning the role of U.S. allies, especially the role of Japan, because grievances over history and nationalism still represent a wild card in international relations, especially in crises between involving both Japan and China. And we want to be more cautious in pushing for Japan's rearming or playing a greater role in the strategy. And last and related point is the need for the U.S. allies and partners to engage in what I would call reciprocal or mutual restraint in their dealing with China. So there's an important, I think there's an imperative for Washington to clearly convey that we don't expect our allies and partners to take actions that may put Beijing in a position of that it feels it have to respond in an escalatory way to demonstrate its resolve. In that way, that might trigger an action reaction spiral down the road. So I'll stop here.
Thanks very much. And I see questions coming in already from the audience, which is great. Please do continue to use the Q&A function below if you'd like any of our speakers to elaborate a bit more on some of the comments they're making here. I want to go next to you, Rorry. There's one assertion that Bill makes in his report. He says China's military strategy is inherently defensive and it has limited ability to project power outside of its own region. I think that's a different characterization than we usually hear, which is more of a China that is aggressive and offensive in its projection of power. I want to know your take on that.
Well, thank you so much for the question, and thanks for having me here on this really important topic and to discuss the results of Bill's paper, which I commend to you if you haven't read. I did want to address this a little bit. Is China's military strategy inherently defensive in nature? Because so often it doesn't feel that way from the outside. So often what we hear about in the news, or what we're overly maybe focused on, is China's more aggressive military maneuvering over territorial issues. But from China's own perspective, it believes that those activities are deterrent in nature. So this is a really difficult knot to untangle when aggression is a bit in the eye of the beholder. And I think I'd like to just stress that, the role of the PLA in the Chinese system is to support the Communist Party's objectives. Some of those objectives have to do with territorial integrity, but it is certainly not the only feature of the Chinese system designed to support Communist Party objectives. I want to emphasize that although a lot of China's territorial ambitions do focus on the military aspect of their strategy, that there are diplomatic, economic, political opportunities to manage the situation and to manage it better than we're managing it now. If we continuously focus on the military balance of power as the sole measure of balancing China's rise, we not only miss critical opportunities to enhance support to allies and partners, but we actually do back into the positions of a security conflict or security spiral, security dilemma, where one side is looking at their own actions as defensive in nature and in response to the actions of the other side, which they perceive as offensive or aggressive in nature. So getting back to the key point, is Chinese military aggression inherently defensive? I think it is to them, and it's really incumbent upon smart people in the United States to start to move away from whether or not military actions are justified or justifiable. Are they correct? Are they right? And to really think about that much, much wider scope of activities that comprise, a real strategy in international relations to defend the interests of the United States and to defend the interests of our allies and partners. And I think that's what we're going to talk about a little bit more in this discussion. So I'm excited to hear my panelists' views.
That's exactly right. Thank you so much, Rorry. That's really helpful. Please do keep those questions coming. I'm going to go back to Bill. Bill, given your assessment that more military spending is not the right way forward to address challenges posed by China, what do you see as the proper path forward?
Well, I think the wrong way to go about it is couched in terms of we need to win a war with China. Representative Adam Smith, who's ranking on House Armed Services, said at a certain point, if we get into a war with China, we're all screwed anyway. So how do we prevent that? And Quincy's report on active denial was mentioned, but in broad strokes, a more defensive strategy, more dispersed assets, reliance on allies, and the goal not being to destroy the Chinese military or strike deep into Chinese territory, basically to avoid the risk of escalation. But of course, once you start a war between two nuclear armed powers, it's hard to control that question of escalation. So far better would be a more assertive diplomatic strategy, kind of revive and stick to the one China concept, where the U.S. doesn't treat Taiwan as a military ally, has sort of limited political relations. China, in turn, pledges not to absorb Taiwan by force, and try to keep that as kind of the norm, the rules of the road. And also, I think more communications back and forth, which the Biden administration has pledged to do. I think more, just kind of a perspective of not getting into this kind of fiery escalatory rhetoric. A couple of things that happened after the Biden-Xi meeting was to talk about perhaps a nuclear weapons dialogue, a dialogue on how to deal with AI-driven weapon systems. So I think those should be taken seriously and pursued. Sometimes you have a summit meeting and you say you're going to do things and they don't happen. But I think that would be a big help. Also, military to military communications are reviving. We were at a point where there was very little communication, which is, the most dangerous position to be in. So I'm hoping that the Biden administration continues with that and doesn't get distracted by some of the sort of the chorus of hawks on the Hill, many of whom I think don't really back up their assertions with a lot of factual evidence.
Thanks for that, Bill. And the Bill's report has been dropped in the chat. We're going to share other resources that are being mentioned by our speakers. Once again, please do keep those questions rolling in the Q&A function below. I want to go to you, Shuxian, to respond to this a bit more. Something you've spoken about is another opportunity cost that comes from the U.S. pouring its dollars into military spending, which is a lack of capacity to engage in more effective economic statecraft. What do you mean by that? And do you want to say a bit more about what you see as the path forward?
Sure. I think it comes with several issues here, because in the first place, by pouring so much resources solely into the military dimension, I think the United States may risk straining and even undercutting alternative foreign policy instruments that can provide more effective but cost efficient solutions or mitigation, such as diplomacy. Because Because if we look at the data for the current fiscal year, the 2024 fiscal year, the requested budget for the State Department, and the USAID is a total of like $63 billion, which is really far dwarfed by the defense budget, But to cope with transnational challenges, that the United States cannot deal with alone, like climate change or pandemic or environmental degradation or drug trafficking, a big defense budget cannot provide a solution, but a bigger investment in diplomacy hopefully could. And also in terms of economic statecraft, I think is another important dimension for the U.S. allies and partners in their dealing with China, because more resources could be allocated to reduce the kind of the potential vulnerability for countries in the region that comes with their growing dependence on China. For example, such as access to the Chinese market, inbound Chinese investment, and raw materials, etc. And also, I think there are precedents where countries in the region may not necessarily see a U.S. military response as most helpful one. A telling example is what happened back in between December 2019 and January 2020, when there was a standoff, multiple month standoff between Chinese Coast Guards, maritime militia vessels, versus a West Coppola, which is a oil rig platform deployed by Malaysia to explore part of EEZ in the South China Sea. When in the United States responded by dispatching a naval fleet to show support for the Malaysia during the standoff, which Malaysians, their response is it didn't help at all, but backfired by escalating the whole situation by giving the Chinese a stronger excuse or justification for further escalation. So I don't think even the regional actors, they do see the need to keep a constant U.S. engagement with the region, but not necessarily in the military dimension.
That's really helpful. I want to pose something close to that same question to you, Rorry, to sort of wrap up my couple of rounds of questioning, and then the audience questions are coming in, so we'll dive right into those. But Rorry, and you've sort of already started to get into this, but how should we think about the military challenge posed by China's capabilities, or should we think beyond military solutions into the political?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think we're getting into some really interesting stuff here, which is also like, is there a strategy of denial that involves denying China the excuse of escalation? Is there like a restraint argument to be made about how we react to situations in the Indo-Pacific, so that we're not digging a hole a little bit deeper, especially for our allies and partners? Let me start there and I'll answer your question. Recently convened a number of high-level diplomats and former diplomats from Southeast Asia, and one takeaway from that really stood out to me was from a former Indonesian official who said, "We're so often asked or told, that there should not be a forced choice between the U.S. and China in the region. But it's not that we don't want to choose between the U.S. and China. It's actually that we choose both. We must choose both the U.S. and China." And I think it's very incumbent on policymakers in the U.S. and in China both to really think about whether or not there are mirroring aspects of great power behavior of countries that simply can exercise and project the use of power beyond their borders, that are mirroring and escalating each other, rather than paying attention to what the real needs of the allies and partners in the Indo-Pacific are, which are namely economic prosperity, climate security, economic security, and human security. And these are not problems that will be resolved by military conflict between the U.S. and China. And in fact, in every case, I believe that would be much worse off if, again, these two nuclear powers go to war with each other. I'm concerned that on the Hill and in the U.S. policy community in general, we're overly focused on gaming out our balance of power strategy by looking at capabilities rather than intentions. And I think this goes back to like being self-reflective about great power behavior, right? So if we don't take into account the fact that the US has political agency in how it reacts, responds, and shapes the security environment in the Indo-Pacific, and China has agency as well, then we put ourselves on a path dependent road toward military conflict. Again, a conflict that I believe no one actually wants, right? But we all feel we must prepare for. So I would just encourage, the listeners in this webinar and others who have influence in the policy community, to think a little bit more deeply about how we could shape intentions and to be willing to live in the uncomfortable space of never knowing the true intentions of your adversary or partner, but be willing to make the relationships that give you a good sense of how the policy community in Beijing is thinking about things. We so often hear, and I'll close on this. I know we have questions. I want to partially respond to one of them. We so often hear that we just shouldn't talk to countries that have political systems that are highly different than ours. And I think that we don't get to choose what political systems other countries have. And we don't really get to choose who we deal with and who we don't. The US interest in maintaining a stable, peaceful, and prosperous Indo-Pacific and world requires us to work with governments that do not look like ours. And it is not up to the US government to confer legitimacy or illegitimacy on other governments. It's simply not practical in the defense of US interests to do so. We have partnerships in the Indo-Pacific with countries that have human rights records that are arguably as bad as China's. We have partners in the Indo-Pacific that have, even recently promoted or defended parts of their society that we would see as antithetical to Western values. And the simple fact is that, we have to all live in this world together, and it requires us to think about how we work directly with those governments that we find illegitimate, instead of trying to split the world into several different competing blocks, which I think history tells us is actually a situation that puts us at a higher risk for conflict and war and destruction. Thank you.
Thank you, Rorry. Before I turn into audience Q&A, I want to make sure the other panelists, are there any other final points you wanted to make sure that you got to make before we jump in? Shuxian, I know you had a quick comment you wanted to give.
Yeah, I want to strongly concur with Rorry as to why the US should keep talking to China, simply because I think the answer is very simple and straightforward, because we don't end up in a nuclear war between two great powers. That's how come that's a major lesson that we learned from the Cuban Missile Crisis back in 1962. That only by having the direct communication between the two countries, regardless of what the other countries look like or what the other side, their political system is, by communicating, by talking to each other, to each other, that's the only way that we can rescue us and the rest of the world from the brink of a nuclear war.
Thank you, Shuxian. Bill, any final comments? Not final, but comments from you before we go to the audience Q&A?
Yeah, one of the things that comes up in terms of how US should relate to China is its human rights record, the repression of the Uyghurs, pushing against the democracy movement in Hong Kong, as well as local things like its activities in the South China Sea. And somehow this is used as yet another reason to confront China militarily. But I think it's exactly the opposite. If we build more aircraft carriers and more nuclear weapons and get an arms race with China, it's just another pretext of the regime to crack down. It's not going to result in more openness or more freedom for the Chinese people. That's got to be pursued, I think, diplomatically on a global scale. But giving China, the Chinese government, an excuse to, point at an external adversary instead of clean up its own act is not going to help the situation.
Thanks very much for that. All right, let me dive into the great questions we're getting here, and viewers, you're more than welcome to continue adding them. let me start with, I think this is maybe a great one to start with, which is, do you all anticipate, is it likely that China will increase its military spending over the next decade to rival the US? Or do you think it will remain in roughly a similar state that it has been in this past year or so? Feel free, speakers, unmute yourself and tackle that one if you like.
May I quickly respond to that?
Of course.
I think political scientist, Thomas Christensen at Columbia University wrote a piece like almost 20 years ago, saying, arguing that China can pose problems to the United States without necessarily having to catch up. And I think it still holds true as of today and going into the foreseeable future, that China doesn't have to match toe to toe with the United States around in every corner of the world. Its priority, its primary strategic direction remains, will very likely remain to be continue to remain in the Western Pacific, the first island chain, second island chain on China's periphery. It'll be the top strategic priority for China. So I think even for its military spending, like I said, I don't think there should be a linear projection into the future, because China's the growth in China's military spending is closely linked to its economic performance, and it's unlikely that given China's economic performance right now, and also going to the future, that it will enable Beijing to pour as much money into as much resources into its military spending as it used to be when the Chinese economic growth was much faster at like two-digit growth rate. So going forward, even if there's going to be there were to be an increase, then still it need to be like broken down to like where they spend the money. It could be because China has been building a lot of ships, naval ships, and new military platforms. That will require going forward. That will require more investment into maintenance rather than building new platforms. So that'll be another drag on on how much the Chinese military can spend more money to developing new platform and technology, etc. And also in recruiting personnel into the military. I think there have been a similar issue for even the U.S. military in getting in recruiting talents into the military. So I think there are a similar issue for the PLA, for the Chinese military, to attracting people with higher education, with more skills into military, rather than going to the private sector, which obviously offers more a much higher salary, right? So I think all these factors need to be taken into consideration when we look at just the number and the figure, and think like how much increase that Chinese military budget will be.
Yeah, in addition to the limits on what China would be likely to spend, it'll be a bit of an action-reaction cycle. China for years had 200 or 300 nuclear warheads that could be delivered long range, versus the U.S. current about 1,700. And they felt that was sufficient for deterrence. There's evidence that they may be building up from there, but I think part of it is their perception that if the U.S. is continuing to build up and put missile defense systems around them and so forth, perhaps their deterrent would be threatened. The ability to have assurance that they have enough nuclear weapons that no one would attack them. So if those perceptions continue, they could continue to build up. But even the Pentagon's most extreme estimates would put at about rough parity, and there wouldn't be a lot of incentive to attack each other unless a conventional war got out of hand, which is why preventing a conventional war is so important. The other thing that's pointed to a lot is emerging technology, AI-driven weapons, hypersonics, pilotless vehicles, sea, land, air. And Deputy Secretary of Defense Kathleen Hicks gave a speech last year to the National Defense Industrial Association, the people who had profited from building this stuff, and said, we're going to have this replicator initiative where we'll build more of these things, and we'll be able to have swarms of 1,000 drones that can hit large numbers of targets in 24 hours. And China's going to have to be on watch against this. They'll think twice before they do anything, knowing that we have superiority. We'll build these things in short order and replace them quickly. And it was kind of like a technological fantasy, the idea that they could do this, that all the weapons would work, that it would intimidate China rather than cause an arms race. And there's real questions about whether these systems might malfunction, resulting in large civilian slaughter or even changing the ability to control our nuclear systems. And it would definitely put everything on a shorter hair trigger or timeline. So, rather than looked at as an area to compete vigorously, I think there should be discussions about how to move slowly, have rules of the road about how these things are pursued. And there's a lot of money going into these systems. And I think the people that are pouring that money in, mostly venture capitalists, should not be the ones driving our policy. They're in it to make money. I don't think they really are assessing carefully what it would mean to rush to deploy these things.
Well, digging a bit more into that point exactly, another question that's been asked from the audience is looking at capabilities more than just raw spending. Are we not already in an arms race? And this person says the U.S. is certainly not coming close to keeping up with shipbuilding or new nuclear weapons. How do you all respond to that?
Well, it's hard to see how you're not keeping up if you have 5 times as many deployed nuclear weapons. And likewise, although they have more ships, the U.S. has far more tonnage of ships, which is the measure of what kind of firepower you have. A lot of those Chinese ships can operate in local waters, but are not going to be, like an aircraft carrier floating around the world. We have about 11 carriers. China has 3. We have 3 times as many advanced combat aircraft as China. We have a large margin in nuclear weapons, and we could adjust as needed if they truly build up in the ways that the Pentagon claims they will. And then I think on emerging technologies, it's a little murky who's ahead, but I think the point is to have a dialogue about how we proceed on that. I think that would be one of the more dangerous places to engage in an arms race. So I think the idea that we're behind, we have to catch up, let's rush to spend on these things is exactly the wrong direction to go in.
Rorry or Shuxian, do you want to comment on that or before I move on to another one? Okay, great. So another one is, could the panelists speak to the question of U.S. military buildup in the Marianas and base building in Okinawa and the Philippines? How provocative is that to China? And can we add the costs of the militarized U.S. approach to China for the people of Guam, CNMI, the Philippines, who would become the first targets in a war with China?
I mean, I think this is a great question. It somewhat answers itself. I think those activities are seen by the U.S. By China as relatively provocative. I mean, I would just take a bit of a broader view and say that there are real differences in how the U.S. and China see the exercise of power in the region. China very much prefers to work with countries one-on-one and to use the leverage that it has with its larger economy, larger military in many cases, as just that, as leverage to kind of resolve political, military, economic disputes in its favor. Our kind of U.S. response to that is to bolster those countries with greater, usually military support, to help even out the leverage. But it is not clear to me that, one, China's leverage strategy ever works. It tends to provoke more backlash than China gets benefits of in the beginning. Or two, that a U.S. approach that doesn't properly kind of take into account the ways that China can use diplomatic and economic leverage actually addresses the problem that our allies and partners are having in the region. Are allies and partners at greater risk if a U.S. and China war were to break out? Absolutely, 100% they are. But really, I think that, knowing that no one wants to go to war as the first option, it's incumbent on us to investigate more the steps that would lead to that type of dramatic escalation, maybe than to just think about the results of what that would look like.
Yeah, I've been kind of start to dig in on the U.S. presence in the Pacific Islands for a book I'm working on. Guam is one of the most important examples because The U.S. Navy has controlled it since 1898. About a third of the territory is for U.S. bases. They're talking about putting in significant numbers of missile defense batteries. They're building a Marine base to take some Marines from Okinawa, where the U.S. presence has generated a lot of local controversy. But I would say the local attitudes are still a bit split. I mean, there's been environmental damage from the U.S. presence. There is the point of that makes Guam more of a target. On the other hand, there's some, especially in the older generation, who remember the U.S. driving out the Japanese occupation. A lot of young people from Guam go into the U.S. military. There is an economic, impact, and the current representative of Guam, non-voting representative in Congress, has been supportive of bringing that money in. So I think it's an issue that's going to be played out, and it's tied in with the question of sovereignty, which is, they don't have full sovereignty. They can't vote in the Congress. There's many aspects that an independent country would have control over that they don't. So I think, listening to the full range of views in Guam and also thinking about how China perceives this, I think would be a better strategy than just viewing, Guam as like a big aircraft carrier kind of thing.
Any other comments on that, Rorry or Shuxian?
Yeah, I'd like to quickly add to what Rorry and Bill just said, because I also recently dug a little bit into the Pacific Island, the U.S. presence in the Pacific Islands. I think from previous Cold War, if we're calling this the current one as a new Cold War, from the old Cold War, the Pacific Island populations, especially the Marshall Islands, the population of Marshall Islands are still dealing with the legacy, the nuclear legacy left from the previous Cold War. So that get me thinking of what kind of legacy we want to pass on for population in this for future generations in this region, in the Pacific Islands areas. As now we are rushing into deals like AUKUS and other military buildup that might after this once when we come out of the current the new Cold War, what kind of legacy or nuclear legacy will add to what we are still dealing with from the previous one, and how populations in this region will be impacted, their health, their socioeconomic well-being, etc.
And just one more thing about the
Sure.
Marshall Islands issue. That there's been a movement for compensation, the Marshall Islanders, for the impacts of U.S. radiation from testing on the health of people there, and it came close this year. RECA, which I believe is the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act, there were strong advocates in Congress, including conservatives like Josh Hawley, but it didn't quite make it over the finish line. But it's indicative of the long-range impacts of those kinds of U.S. presence, that this is something that goes back decades and still hasn't been resolved.
Absolutely. Well, so another question sort of asks the corollary of some of these things we've been discussing about what China perceives as provocative. This question from the audience member says, how do you characterize China's recent actions directed at the Philippines surrounding the Sierra Madre and elsewhere in the Second Thomas Shoal? Does not provoking China mean ceding legitimacy to their unilateral territorial claims in the South China Sea? And so how do we and other nations assert freedom of navigation in international waters and airspace without provoking China? It's a big question. Do y'all feel free to unmute yourselves and jump in on that one?
Sure. I mean, I'll take that in general terms again, and leave the kind of more operational details to my co-panelists. But I don't agree with the premise of the question that there's a binary choice between defending freedom of navigation, or like in ceding territorial claims to China and defending freedom of navigation. Not a binary choice. The circumstances of what's happening on the ground matter a lot. For example, in this most recent kind of altercation between the Chinese and Philippines, it was really about resupply for a ship that's been docked, so to speak, stationary at the Second Thomas Shoal for a number of years. And what I would emphasize in this particular analysis of this event is that this was really a political problem. This is a political problem that happened between China and the Philippines. It's not necessarily a military problem. The military aspects drew out of the political issue, which is that from China's perspective, the Philippines said they would decommission the ship, which is in a disputed territory that both sides claim. The Philippines never did that, which, is fine, their right to do. They have people stationed on it that need to get resupplied, and that resupply needs to happen in order to keep their people safe. To me, that is not inherently a military or territorial problem. It's a nuanced political positioning problem that would be most easily and accurately, and in fact was, addressed between diplomacy, by diplomacy between the Philippines and China. So I think that actually the aftermath of this incident, and which is still ongoing, and we'll see how it plays out over the long term, shows that problems that we see as freedom of navigation issues have histories and circumstances that are so much deeper than just like, can you sail wherever international law allows. The way to defend our freedom of navigation principles is to conduct freedom of navigation exercises around the world, any place where international law says we can fly, sail, and operate, and perhaps to de-emphasize the fact that we often do those in the Indo-Pacific, and bury the fact that we do those all over the world, including with countries that we have very close and friendly relations with. We dispute their maritime territorial claims as well. Another aspect of this is that we should get international business on board for freedom of navigation claim exercises. It's the effect of navigation denial certainly has a military component, but the first impact that will be felt is in global shipping. And so to the extent that we can remind the world that this is not a military problem between the US and China, but it's a set of political dynamics, and B, the outcome of a real incident of territorial denial is not just the military component, but is really about disrupting the patterns of commerce in the world, the more that we'll have kind of a more comprehensive ability to approach this, so we're not stuck in thinking it's a binary choice between doing freedom of navigation and supporting China's territorial claims.
Yeah, no, I concur with that. I think, for the United States to have leverage for a more political diplomatic approach, which I don't think is solely in the hands of the US, but if we had a more balanced policy overall in terms of the strategic relationship, and also if the United States was on board with things like the law of the sea, which we've never ratified, I think we'd have a stronger position than we do now.
That's helpful. Thank you. So something that's coming up a lot in the questions and very relevant to lawmakers as well is the issue of Taiwan. How do you all respond both to the recent elections in Taiwan and speculation by some analysts that China may have preparations to invade in the near future? Are we at a crisis point in the way that many perceive us to be in?
I'm happy to take a first glance at this question. So I don't think we're at a crisis point, but it doesn't mean that the underlying dynamics can't come to a head at a later time. I believe very strongly, based on over a decade of working track twos on cross-Taiwan Strait relations, including the only track two that I'm aware of that brings together participants from the US, Taiwan, and the PRC to talk about these very issues, that China's preferred policy option remains peaceful unification. There's lots of reasons for that. One, I do not think that China has confidence in its military to deliver a victory on Taiwan. I think that's, maybe that is up there on the top. But the second is that I think that there's a real aversion in Chinese culture to going to war, into another hot civil war. And third, I think that China, the leadership in Beijing fundamentally believes, and I think erroneously, that China is inevitably rising, the West is in inevitable decline, and there is a future in the world where peaceful reunification by absorption happens naturally, if one can absorb a political system naturally. So I think for all of these reasons, China would be happy to kick this cross-strait can down the road. The problem that China is confronting is that it set some very specific red lines for what would trigger action. And it wants to make sure that those red lines are respected by completing shows of military power, again, as what China thinks of as a deterrent to de jure declaration of Taiwan independence, which is the ultimate red line. We're in a position right now where the election in Taiwan has produced a leader that is China's least preferred option, we'll just put it that way. It means that the official communication between Taipei and Beijing is frozen and will be frozen for some time. Beijing will never concede to talking to a DPP government that has independence as a party plank in its founding charter. I don't see a situation in which the DPP leader, in this case William Tsai, can come up with a formula of one China that is acceptable to Beijing. That gives the US a very outsized role in the cross-strait relationship. And so it's particularly incumbent, I think, on members of Congress to think about what could be done to materially support Taiwan's autonomy without throwing weight behind a political position of Taiwan's permanent separation from the PRC, that you actually start to provoke the stronger response from China. I think I'll stop there, but I'm happy to talk more about any of those dynamics. It's a very complicated situation to cover in a few minutes.
Well, thanks for that. I think the other thing to consider is the consequences of a war over Taiwan. CSIS did some war games, and that's, based on their assumptions, but nonetheless, they found the U.S. could lose tens of thousands of troops, Taiwan's economy would be devastated, and the U.S. position in the world would be weakened in many ways. And China must also be doing its own assessments of what a war would do on their side. And of course, there is the risk of nuclear escalation, which would be an unprecedented disaster. So I'm not as informed about the internal workings of China as some of the other panelists, but it seems to me that they would not be itching to go to war. And some of the statements by, U.S. generals saying, oh, it's going to be 2025 are not helpful. And in fact, it was interesting to me that somebody in the chain of command could say that and keep their job, because it's not really their purpose or point or a responsibility to be making those kind of statements. So I think the more we kind of hype the idea that China's willing to go without evidence to prove that, it's just another point of tension. And I think it clouds our ability to think through what an effective policy would actually be.
To quickly add on what Rorry and Bill just said, I think there's one prevailing view is that when Xi Jinping sees himself as in domestic trouble, like China's stagnated economy or other kind of domestic political issues, he might resort to a diversionary conflict by starting a war on Taiwan. But I want to underscore that there's an equally appealing rationale in China's past behavior when it comes to territory and sovereignty issue, that is diversionary peace, which basically argues that when China's facing serious domestic political security issues, it tends to tone down to soften its external approach unless it perceives the other side, the other parties are pressing too hard as to really compromise China's bargaining position or claim strength in the sovereignty issues.
Thanks very much. All those are really helpful reflections on a complicated question. We've got time for one, maybe two more questions. This is a good one. An audience member asks your opinion on the Pacific Deterrence Initiative, which has now been around for about 4 years. Former Armed Services Committee in the House Chairman Mac Thornberry and Kimberly Lane at CSIS have argued that it's a good idea. It has just fallen short of expectations because it has been underfunded and misused. And they offer recommendations to get it back on track. Others have argued that the premise itself is flawed and that it's the wrong place for investments. I'm curious if you all have a reaction to the PDI generally, or thoughts on its future.
Well, in one way, it's somewhat symbolic in that large parts of the existing military budget are justified because China is seen as the so-called pacing threat. So to add a special category onto that, to me, is almost more of a symbolic gesture than a serious undertaking. Now, there's been debates about, is it enough, and are they spending on the right things? And but I think a debate about the bigger strategy would be perhaps more useful than talking about this separate initiative, which to me seems a little redundant. If you're saying China is your primary pacing threat, why do you need a separate account as opposed to just figuring out how to spend, an 800 billion plus budget?
Thanks, Bill. All right, we've just got a couple of minutes here. So I actually might just give the panelists the final word if there is sort of a wrap-up comment each of you might want to leave the audience with as we close out this discussion. Anything you didn't get to say, anything you've been inspired to be sure to mention while we're here. Shuxian, any final words from you?
Yeah, I just want to quickly add on, what Taiwan, we talk about Taiwan, some narrative will refer to, if the United States don't come to the defense of Taiwan, then it'll lead to the question of U.S. commitment and credibility from its other allies and partners in the region as to how much support they can expect from the United States in times of a confrontation or a crisis with China. But I want to know that if in the event of a military conflict between China and the United States, the potential cost to both sides, not only to China, to Taiwan, but also to the United States, even in military terms, could be potentially huge, even if short of nuclear war. So that brings to the question of whether when coming out of an armed conflict in Taiwan Strait, whether the United States, even if it still have the resolve to remain a credible ally, does it still have a capability to remain a credible ally to provide the same security guarantee for other allies in the region? So I think that's something we need to be aware when talking about the credibility issue, the resolve issue when talking about Taiwan, thinking about Taiwan.
Thank you. With our last minute, let me go to Rorry and then Bill for wrap-up thoughts.
I'd just say that there is always a tendency to try to evaluate what we're doing and see what's working and what's not. We do a lot of analysis and evaluation on our military programs and military activities. We do quite a bit less on diplomacy. So they've shared in the link project that I did looking at the diplomatic outcomes of the strategic and economic dialogue. Please do have a look if you're interested in what the value of diplomacy is, and happy to engage with any participants offline, on how we best measure diplomacy and diplomatic efforts to make sure we're at least giving it equal shrift with our defense analysis.
Well, I'm not going to treat it like a talk show. I might go over 30 seconds, but I think the most important thing is to kind of lower the temperature of the debate in Washington. I think the fact that the Biden administration is talking to China should be reinforced and supported, because there's going to be a lot of push in the other direction. I think we should be debating what's an effective policy towards China and what's a more balanced policy, not how do we intimidate China? How do we win a war against China? I think that's a losing proposition. And I think it'll make the world more dangerous. It'll make some people a lot of money, but I don't think that's really the way we want to go if we want a safer world.
It's a great way to leave us off. Let me thank my wonderful panelists. I've learned so much from this reality check discussion. Thank you again to the Cost of War Project for producing Bill's paper, for hosting us. Thank you to the Quincy Institute for co-hosting and for hosting Bill as well. Participants, you're going to receive an email with all these great links that Melissa from the Cost of War Project, and big thanks to her for organizing this conversation. She's been posting in the chat for those of you viewing over live stream. Feel free to reach out if you don't receive that, and please do to have a look at the reports, the articles that our panelists and others have been producing on this really important topic. It is so critical to get that viewpoint in there as the debate moves forward in Congress on how we spend our federal budget. So thanks again to all. Have a wonderful afternoon.